Hey top percenters, Writer Joey here. Once again, I thought I'd try something a little different. Instead of covering an up and coming card or deck, I thought I'd look at a card that's already in format and has stirred up some minor debate, namely Ghetsis. A card that's viewed anywhere between good and awful, and to be honest, I think it's a good card. But before I get into that, let's look at the card itself. Ghetsis is a supporter card from the set Plasma Freeze, which allows you to look at your opponent's hand and has your opponent shuffle any trainer item cards in there back into their deck. Then, for every card returned to your opponent's deck, you draw a card. Now, already I'm hoping people see why I like this card. It offers so many advantages. You can see your opponent's hand, you deprive them of item cards, and you get to draw. Or said differently, you gain information on your opponent's current options, you limit their immediate options, and you gain resources. But of course, Ghetsis does have its downsides. Most noticeable one being the fact that it's not a guaranteed draw, both in the ability to draw or on how many cards you may draw. This on its own can make planning at your turn past Ghetsis a little more challenging and a lot less certain. So with that huge drawback in mind, why do I like this card so much? Well, it's all about timing and numbers. You see, Ghetsis is a unique card when it comes to timing. Most cards are beneficial either in the early to mid game or in the mid to late game. Examples of this would be N, which is great in the early to mid game as you'll still have a few prizes and therefore will draw a decent number of cards, whereas in the late game you'll most likely draw 1 or 2 cards. And Colress, which is bad in the early game as both you and your opponent won't have many Pokemon on the bench and you'll draw next to nothing from it, but in the mid to late game you'll have both set up and the potential draw will be amazing. Ghetsis doesn't follow this convention. In fact, it doesn't really touch the mid game. Sure, you can use it there, but it's most effective in the early and late game. Now, I know some people will argue the fact that Ghetsis is awful in the early game, but it can be crucial in limiting the advantage your opponent can generate from the opening hand. The majority of opening turns tend to lead by playing items out of hand, then following on with a supporter, then maybe playing more items. And that's where Ghetsis puts its work in. Your opponent can't use items to set up and then use a supporter to get more items to set up further. At most, they can attach an energy and use 1 item if they drew into it, before using the supporter. Sure, it isn't a lot, but it's a hindrance to your opponent, and it limits the advantage they can gain in their earlier turns. Now we can look at the opposite end of the game. How often does a win come down to, if they have catcher, I lose? In the late game, your opponent is going to start conserving cards, so if they need them to finish the game, they have them available. A swift Ghetsis puts their key cards back in the deck, meaning they have to draw them out again, meaning that game-winning catcher is no longer a guarantee. Now, we also have the plus and minus game, which is basically what Ghetsis is. Ghetsis is a way to generate pluses from minusing your opponent. You have to remember that every card you take away from your opponent's hand, you effectively replace in your own. Now, playing Ghetsis itself is technically a -1. This can be said about any supporter. It just tends to be that most supporters replace themselves. So if you send 1 item back from your opponent's hand, you effectively break even on your hand size. But your opponent is still -1. And if you take any more than 1 card from your opponent's hand, you effectively plussed overall. So really the drawback from Ghetsis isn't too awful if you can deliver a good turn with the hand you already had before playing it. But those are just my thoughts on the card. What about you guys? What do you think about Ghetsis? Do you think it's a worthwhile card? Or that I've just hyped it way too hard? Let me know down below. And until next time, I'm the guy that calls himself Predator Joey. You're what I call the top percent. Peace out.